Okay, everybody, we're about to start our second panel, which is on governance, transparency, and national and local government control of revenues. My name is Patricia Vázquez, and I will be the moderator of this panel. We will be discussing issues related to questions of transparency, accountability, and institution building, both at the national and at the local level. And we're very grateful to have a fantastic panel here today, and I will briefly introduce them. Tony Bebbington will be our first speaker. He's the Milton P. and Alice C. Higgins Professor of Environment and Society at Clark University. Danny Kaufman, the President of Natural Resource Governance Institute. Gabriel Baccarat, the Executive Director of Avena Foundation, and Juan Cruz Vieira, the Extractive Specialists at the Inter-American Development Bank. And they will be talking in that order. You have 10 to 15 minutes to talk, and I will be letting you know when you're exceeding your time. And I wanted to let you all know that after this, there will be a networking lunch where everybody will be invited. So then, Tony, if you would like to start.
Okay. Bueno, me disculparán, mis notas están en inglés, entonces voy a hablar en inglés, pero podemos discutir en español después, disculpa. So in my 10-15 minutes, I just want to make 5 or 6 points. And hopefully there's a sequence to the points. The first is an observation on the scope of transparency, what we take to be that scope. Second are observations around capacities for transparency. Third, around conflict and the politics underlying the transparency capacities. Fourth, around fragilities, the fragilities of transparency. And fifth, around capacities for conflict transformation and governance. So those are my 5 areas that I'd like to speak to. So the first observation is, it seems it's obvious, but I think it's important to make, is that transparency is so much more than a revenue discussion. EITI has already recognized this and how it's broadened its concerns in transparency. But I think if you look at the domestic politics in the broad sense of the term surrounding extraction, a large part of that politics is related to issues of transparency in domains other than revenue and expenditure. So when we see greater calls for consultation and transparency around initial decisions to grant concessions for exploration, around project design, around the social environmental performance of operations, we're seeing demands for transparency in other domains, reflected in calls for zonificación ecológica económica, ordenamiento territorial, consulta previa, citizen-based monitoring of environmental performance, and so on. In some sense, some real sense, these are all also demands for transparency and forms of governance to allow for transparency in those domains. And I think the implication is that focusing any transparency discussion just on fiscal questions is just not enough and can divert attention away from these domains. So that's my first observation. Transparency is much more than the question of revenue and expenditure. The second thought is that the capacities required for transparency in these different domains vary in nature, complexity, and in quality across the countries of the region. And I think it may seem, es difícil to build capacities around revenue transparency, but I think a case can be made that that's still somewhat more straightforward than in some of these other domains. And indeed, some countries in the region have made great progress. Peru would be one of them in enhancing revenue transparency. But if we look at transparency in these other environmental and social domains, I'd suggest that things look much more precarious. Just as 2 or 3 examples. So El Salvador, as it's trying to work out what to do about hard rock mining, has a Ministry of Environment with a great deal of goodwill and commitment, but is only able to monitor water quality and quantity at a limited number of sites across the country, and has just a handful of people to review environmental impact statements of all sorts, not just for extractives, should that sector go ahead. Ecuador, I have a doctoral student working on this environmental monitoring of oil in Ecuador right now, and what comes out of that doctoral research is, again, just how stretched people in ministry are to be able to do such monitoring, not just because of lack of resources to visit sites, but also because of exceedingly complex legislation and set of reglamentos that are difficult to get a handle on for staff in the ministries. And Peru, even though Peru has made important progress in building capacities for this in its Ministry of Environment, they remain vulnerable, and I want to get back to that a little bit later. The point being, it's not easy to produce the basic information required for transparency in these other realms. And the alternative of communities or companies themselves providing the information necessary for transparency immediately encounters the problem of the credibility of the data that's produced by companies or communities. Not necessarily because it's not credible, but because it's perceived to be interested data. So I think there's a question there around the scope that might exist for taking an EITI type model, tripartite sort of arrangements at the national level, to build more credible knowledge for transparency in these other domains. And you can see a few experiments in that sense across the country. So the small organization called ETEC, in working with governments and federations of indigenous communities in both Loreto in Peru and in Zamora in Ecuador, is precisely trying to do that, to try and find tripartite ways of producing data that would have more credibility for environmental transparency around oil operations. So the third observation is that these constraints on the capacity for transparency make clear the budgetary constraints on transparency. But I think it's also helpful and important to take ideas from a range of literatures. I mentioned the political settlements literature just as one, to recognize that the institutional forms and capacities that exist also exist in relation to underlying political agreements. The broader asymmetries and coalitions and alliances among political and economic actors have a great deal of influence on the sorts of institutions and capacities that exist and the scope for institutional change. So in a recent paper, Javier Arellano Yanguas and Andres Mejia Costa, in looking at this is a revenue question, in looking at the current state of revenue allocation related to extractives across the Andean region, come to the conclusion that the explanation of those revenue allocation mechanisms and patterns boils down to three main factors: prior institutional conditions, the bargaining power of subnational actors, and the degree of political alignment of subnational and national elected political actors. So the political, that sort of read, I think, is important for various reasons, but one, that it draws our attention to the notion that institutions for transparency are more often demanded than they are freely given, for reasons related to those political settlements, which raises the question as to under what conditions might the parties to those settlements acquiesce to greater transparency, not just around revenue, but in these other domains. I think looking across the region, one set of postulates might be that this might happen when the dominant coalition changes, for whatever reason, significant change of government, when there is domestic conflict that's sufficiently strong as to induce some change, or when there's international pressure, both in the form of critique and incentives to change transparency arrangements. Incentives such as, for instance, processes of applying to become an OECD country, creating incentives to open up transparency in other parts of the government's arrangements. So, third observation, there's a politics to the institutions and capacities for transparency that exist that raises the question under what conditions might transparency be more likely to be offered when under normal conditions it's not offered. The fourth observation is that the fact that transparency arrangements are contested also means that they can be reversed, and they can be sometimes short-lived. And again, I want to go back to the case of the Ministry of Environment in Peru as an example of that, where one might argue that after a series of apparent gains in building capacity to generate information and processes for transparency around environmental and social questions, there's been a subsequent pushback on those capacities and authorities. So transparency arrangements are not are vulnerable. This is a fragility question, which I think in turn raises the question of, if transparency arrangements are fragile, what sorts of capacities need to exist or have to exist for different actors to continue demanding the continued existence of those governance arrangements for transparency. Arguably, changes that have come in through international regulations that might be tied to OECD membership and the like will be more resilient. But changes that have derived from domestic mobilization within country may be less resilient. So I think that makes the question of building capacities for vigilance that much more important. And those capacities can be built in diverse sectors, both in society and in the state. And again, I think the region gives us some examples of the sorts of capacities that can continue to demand levels of transparency and the protection of governance arrangements for transparency. The Defensoría del Pueblo in Peru, Procurator's Office in other countries, would be one example of an institution with a set of capacities that has continued to press for the continued existence of transparency mechanisms. In civil society, we have examples such as, and I'm just raising these because one of our mandates was to talk about specifics, organizations such as Propuesta Ciudadana in Peru, which has gone a very long way in developing capacities around revenue transparency and in pushing for the subnationalization of transparency discussions. Also in Peru and across the Amazon region, we have work that's been done to build capacities around issues of geovisualization of extractive industries, that's to say mapping the relationship between extractives, territories, natural resources, in groups such as the Amazon Network for Socio-Environmental Geoinformation, or NGOs like Cooperación in Peru. Analytical capacities in civil society that are an important mechanism and continuing to demand transparency. This is less specific, but capacities in society to keep these questions of transparency in public debate are also arguably important to protect them against their otherwise fragility. And so building capacities in the media of different sorts to continue pushing for and demanding transparency seems to be important. And of course in indigenous organizations and other forms of social movement. But the point being that the capacity to continue demanding transparency is as important as the initial capacities that trigger moves towards transparency for those institutional changes to be resilient. And the fifth and final observation is that if capacities for transparency and proclivities to be transparent in the sector are not freely given but demanded, and that conflict has played an important role in the offering up and the opening of conflict, not necessarily full frontal, but conflict in its broadest sense of the term, has played an important role in opening up those domains of transparency. It's also the case that those processes of conflict, in most instances, never specify the nuts and bolts of what transparency should look like. So if conflict is a driver of institutional change around transparency, it remains important for there to be capacities that are able to transform that conflict into specific proposals for what transparency would look like. I think the historical record of institutions for social inclusion tells us a lot about that as well. Those are institutions that have not been freely given in the history of my country, UK. They've been ones that have been demanded, but have also required capacities to transform those demands into specific arrangements. Absent those capacities to transform conflict into governance arrangements, the risk, of course, is that we've moved towards a cycle of conflict, a vicious cycle of conflict leading to further conflict, of conflict driving process of criminalization and repression, thank you. Or even, it's the case that I've been indirectly involved with recently, well right now still, even for further loss of extractive industries themselves. In the case of Minera Yanacocha in northern Peru, one might argue that the chronic incapacity of Yanacocha to read conflict and to be able to transform it into governance arrangements that can work with the communities and populations in the area of Cajamarca has led, among other things, to a further loss of legitimacy, at least for Yanacocha, and arguably for extractives as a whole in the north of Peru. And again, there's evidence across the region of these capacities to transform conflict into proposals. One case, again, being the Human Rights Ombudsman in Peru. So all I wanted to lay out was the notion that transparency is so much more than a revenue question. It's like, I don't know if it's the final frontier, but there are other frontiers to open up around transparency discussion. That the capacities required for transparency in different domains of extraction are quite different, and are arguably more complex in environmental and social domains than in the revenue domain. That historical record suggests that those capacities are not freely given; they have to be demanded. That understanding, therefore, the capacities that exist in one place at a point in time is also related to understanding the underlying political settlements. That for that reason, capacities are fragile, and therefore capacities to continue demanding transparency are as important as the capacities to think about, to demand it in the first instance. Thank you.
Danny?
Buenos días. Good morning. I'll also speak in English, but then in the Q&A we can go to Spanish, and some of the slides will have some Spanish. For full disclosure, I'm a proud citizen of Latin America from Chile, and sometimes my bias may show, so I want to have full disclosure. Thanks, Tony, for the great presentation. One way of summarizing perhaps is to say that transparency in revenues is necessary but not sufficient, has to be complemented. I like to expand that and say transparency is necessary but insufficient. And in that sense, I like to tie the excellent first panel that you had here and link it with the institutional governance challenge. If you came out somewhat worried from what Augusto presented, just wait. Once we get into institutions and so on, maybe I'll give a heads up. I think we can say, and I say it as a Latin American, Houston, we do have a problem. So without further ado, and for the sake of time, don't worry about all the text. I will make the whole presentation available. So apologies in advance. I will be skipping some of the text, but I want to show a few slides that complement what was done in the first session, but much more focused on the institutional issues and not so much on the macro. But the bottom line I want to stress here is that, yes, we saw some progress in terms of macroeconomic policies in Latin America, in many Latin American countries, as well as some social progress. Absolute poverty numbers went down and so on. But that was not complemented during the super cycle era with longer-term political and institutional reforms, which have been pending in Latin America for a very long time. Of course, there's enormous variance, and we will go through that very, very quickly. But it's worth really asking and comparing with the rest of the world, and particularly with some comparable regions like East Asia, as well as the new Europe, the Eastern and Central Europeans. And the picture is quite dire. We see here, using 4 of the 6 indicators of the worldwide governance indicators. For full disclosure, I'm one of the authors, so we use them quite a bit. But one can use other types of indicators for institutions, for corruption, whether it's Transparency International or ours. But in this case, if we look at the picture very quickly, whether it's in voice and democratic accountability, Latin America has had a relative strength, although it hasn't had that much progress over the past 10 years, but compared with emerging East Asia. But by now, Central and Eastern Europe is ahead in all of them, whether it's voice and accountability, rule of law, effectiveness of the government, control of corruption, or the others that are not here. So we in Latin America are staying behind in general on that. And that's particularly the case, with the exception of Chile and maybe one other, particularly the case in resource-rich countries. So we do have a serious issue. In fact, here we see the progression on over time, the same type of indicators, but just for corruption. And we see that Latin America, there was no improvement during that super cycle era. If anything, it's very slight deterioration. And that's different than Central and Eastern Europe, different emerging East Asia. It's worth noting that the rich countries also deteriorated some, but that's for a different type of discussion. Of course, much of the story is in the variance, in the variation across countries, and that's where eventually we need to focus. It's misleading just to focus on averages for the whole country. So we do have a very interesting story in Uruguay. In countries like Uruguay, even in Paraguay, there has been a non-trivial improvement from a very low base this is again control of corruption, but it does apply in some of the other key elements too. Totally contrasting countries like Venezuela and other resource-rich countries that did not necessarily improve, but not all. Now this matters, and I just said we can discuss it later, but for the sake of time, this is part of previous research with my co-author in terms of the indicators. We have also produced research papers. This is our Cray, showing the extent to which there is a major development dividend from improvements in governance. And that's essentially on average, taking all the countries in the world over a long period of time, it's about 300% development dividend. What is that? It means that on average, other things constant, one can expect a threefold increase in per capita income, from $5,000 to $15,000, or from $15 to $45 to $50,000 in the very long term, as a result of a one standard deviation improvement in governance, whether it's control of corruption, rule of law, government effectiveness, and so on. So it does pay. But what's interesting for our panel today is that that applies at least as much, if not more, for resource-rich countries. So the whole notion that being blessed, quote unquote, or cursed by oil or mining can substitute having good governance and good institutions doesn't apply. In fact, the whole notion of the oil curse is because of the interaction with poor governance in many settings that essentially hampers exploiting those resources for the benefit of all in a country. So this is to say this matters and matters enormously. Unfortunately, this is from around the world, and especially emerging and developing economies. Resource-rich countries, on average, have not improved over the period, as I mentioned before, which is not the case with other countries. So not only that, but it's a very different level. In terms of the extent of the challenge is much, much larger. And again, this is whether it's control of corruption, rule of law, or other factors. I'm not showing all the slide. Now, let's look at this one quickly. One may think, oh, I'm repeating one of Augusto's slides in terms of showing whatever happens in the rest of the world is in terms of growth patterns. This is what happens in Latin America because everything is driven by outside factors. And that was one of your sobering initial points. Well, not quite. Yes, it looks exactly the same, but this is the pattern of revenues and the pattern of expenditures for one particular country, Venezuela. Unfortunately, this is the case for most resource-rich countries. The volatility in revenues, which is in essence a blue line, is practically matched. And whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Iran, and whether it's many other countries, one sees exactly the same pattern. It's matched by the expenditures. That's the extent to which countries have not been prepared from a macroeconomic, institutional, and governance perspective for what essentially happens in terms of the major volatility that one ought to expect in this field. Well, but that's not universal. So Venezuela is now on the right, and I have added Chile. Of course, I'm biased, but Chile on the left. It's a very different picture. So Chile, yes, Chile cannot do anything, just like any other country, like Augusto said, about the volatility in terms of the revenues, except for being so dependent on those resources. And diversification is another story we need to discuss. But that matches that. But it's completely different macroeconomic, a macroeconomic framework that, including the sovereign wealth funds and reserves and so on, the savings that are used counter-cyclically, which leads to a red line, which is the expenditure, which is much, much smoother. So I would posit that what you said earlier is absolutely right on average about Latin America, but the variation is such that in countries that have much better policies, institutions, and governance can have a much higher impact on their own growth than just being driven by external factors. And in fact, we have done some work at Natural Resource Governance Institute, the organization I lead, regarding different types of countries, and some were relatively well prepared, like Chile, Norway, Oman, Peru, Timor-Leste. This is with a variety of macroeconomic institutional governance indicators, very much in contrast with Equatorial Guinea, Iran, Mongolia, Nigeria, Venezuela, Yemen, and a number of others. So I think it's very important to learn from the lessons of variance of countries that were relatively prepared and are facing different types of challenges than those that were not. Now, very quickly, just in a few remaining minutes, to say something about what are innovations initiatives in these areas. So of course, one, and following Tony's presentation and this panel, relate to transparency, and there are global initiatives there, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and related to that, Publish What You Pay, have spurred a whole movement in disclosure. 51 countries have already joined. Unfortunately, very few in Latin America have joined, so that's an area for pending progress there. There are questions about effectiveness and so on. We can discuss more EITI later. I happen to sit in the board, so that's an area I wanted to highlight. It's very important. But that's a voluntary framework that countries choose to join, and then they commit to do certain things. They can adopt or not adopt legislation at the country level. But complementary to that, there are major global legislative inroads towards mandatory requirements. That is very focused on payment transparency, which, as mentioned before, is only one aspect. The Dodd-Frank, which is about to be finalized, hopefully, without further challenges from some in the big oil. European Union is already in motion, fully adopted in terms of mandatory disclosure. In the UK is already under full implementation. Other countries have started. Canada is well underway, progress. Norway and Australia making significant inroads. So it's a train that has departed in terms of transparency of payments. As suggested earlier, there's much more than transparency in payments. And that's one of the innovations in Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, or EITI, that moved from focusing in the early years until 2013 was only about payment transparency. Now it covers much more of the whole value and decision-making chain, from allocation of rights to production data, revenue collection, which was before, but also state enterprises, subnational is very important now, and some on social impact and revenue management as well. Even further, going in terms of the tools, one of the diagnostic and analytical tools that we have put forth is the Natural Resource Charter, to basically diagnose throughout the whole chain all aspects of addressing the main issues in natural resource governance, which relate to domestic institutions and governance issues, the international governance framework, including the EITI and other very important, but then going through every stage of the chain internally and what are the key decisions regarding strategy, exploration, taxation, local impacts, allocation of revenues, and so on. Associated with that, another tool that we have is the Resource Governance Index. We had one 2013. We're going to have one later in the year that assesses from an empirical perspective these issues and goes into detail country by country. Will be about 90 countries total in terms of these issues. This is for illustration for governance. Let me end given the timing with two concluding slides. One is on the importance of seizing the opportunity of low commodity prices. It poses major challenges for resource-rich countries. They were discussed in the first session very well, so I don't need to go through the fiscal strains, living standards issues, social strains. Let's keep in mind that while poverty did diminish during the super cycle, still 1/3 of Latin American people live under $5 a day. Of course, we're so focused around the world on the 1.25 or $2, but $5 a day. If we look at $5, we still have 1/3 of our all region. So we have a major issue. Inequality, yes, declined slightly over the period, but it's still the most unequal region on Earth, and by far. So we still have a major problem. There are differential lessons between the prepared and not so prepared countries. I mentioned that. And there's much more questioning now. Who benefited from the super cycle? Super cycle came and went. Some benefited, some did not. There is much lower tolerance now for mismanagement, much lower tolerance for corruption and impunity. We're seeing social protests in many countries in the region already. The Petrobras, Brazil is one example, Central America and others. There are social pressures for reform. So this era of low commodity prices means that there are opportunities that are already being seized, and some of the social pressures are coming to bear. Reducing energy subsidies in Mexico, strengthening tax compliance, savings, more effective revenue sharing at the subnational level, reforming state-owned enterprise is really important. It was mentioned before the case of Pemex. They're starting reforms. Petrobras, hopefully, that will go that way too. Anti-corruption programs are being taken more seriously. The Chile case is very interesting, which we can discuss later. So concluding reflections then, deepening transparency reforms is really important and going beyond, as was said before, just focusing on payment or narrow things. The political and party finance issues are critical. Beneficiary ownership, conflict of interest, the commitment to EITI. Subnational, I already mentioned it. It's key, and I'm not doing full justice. Other panelists will surely discuss a lot, and that's something that Patricia, in your book, in your brilliant book on the Amazon, it's very important to focus on. Prominent role for the civil society, for media and think tanks. We're seeing that in Central America, we're seeing that in Chile. That's where the pressure is coming from. And some of the leadership in terms of some of these governance and anti-corruption reforms. This is not just supply side driven, which one cannot expect. Rule of law. In the whole field of natural resource governance, we have not paid sufficient attention to the problems with rule of law, the subpart judiciary. A very interesting case study is Brazil. What's happening now in Brazil can be seen as also very healthy because it would have been unthinkable 10 years, 15 years ago. It has been the major improvement in rule of law and in the judiciary that is allowing for the major exposure of this corruption that has existed for decades. So what has the story, the case study of the judiciary improvement in Brazil is very interesting. Chile is another case in point. Major revamp. This is an opportunity for major revamp of the national oil companies. This is not only about Latin America, but it's something we're working in many other countries as well. and we can discuss that further. And then one point before last is the global initiatives and having mutual accountability. The rich countries of the North have a major responsibility in these. That's why big oil multinationals have to support this mandatory disclosure, as well as the OECD anti-bribery enforcement, the tax havens being addressed by G7 and EITI. The rigorous diagnostic tools and data power we already discussed. And last but not least, at the end of the day, the country differences are just so important. So to work at the country level, and not only at the country level, but at the subnational level, and as Patricia would say, at the project level, and tailoring the solutions of that. So even though my presentation was quite aggregate, it's not that one can come in with any book from the outside that would apply uniformly. And each country basically requires a benchmarking and in-depth diagnosis, and would have different challenges that would have to be tailored to its own reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gabriel?
Ok, muchas gracias a Cindia, al Wilson Center y al Banco Mundial por esta invitación. Yo quiero empezar esta intervención preguntándonos, ¿tenemos los latinoamericanos razones justificadas para desconfiar de las extractivas? ¿Tenemos los latinoamericanos esos indígenas revoltosos que están parando proyectos ahí, mineras, petroleras, ductos? ¿Tienen razón? ¿Son politiqueros? ¿Qué es lo que está pasando? ¿Tienen razón cuando los indígenas piden audiencias públicas y las mismas son consideradas chantajes por parte de los gobiernos y las empresas? Cuando uno ve el mapa de conflictos que ha preparado Oxfam, el escenario es muy complejo. Estamos ante un escenario en la que hay una olla de presión que está hirviendo a baja intensidad, en la que cuando nosotros ponemos conflictos mineros, con conflictos petroleros, con conflictos de tierras, de soya, en fin, estamos ante un escenario de bastante complejidad. ¿Pero por qué? Porque además los latinoamericanos, no sé quién decía que proyectar o planificar es poner futuro al pasado. Y es eso, los latinoamericanos no tenemos la posibilidad y no tenemos la narrativa de pensar nuestro desarrollo fuera de los recursos naturales. O sea, tenemos una dependencia de narrativa, no conocemos. Entonces no nos podemos imaginar otro desarrollo que no sea basado en los recursos naturales, en la minería, en el petróleo, en el gas, en no sé qué, no sé cuánto. Y esta misma ha sido absolutamente esquiva para beneficiar a los latinoamericanos. Por eso es de que yo quiero compartir lo que me parece muy bien la introducción que hacían nuestros colegas que nos antecedían en la palabra, que los temas centrales de transparencia, de institucionalidad, son fundamentales porque la única posibilidad que tiene América Latina y la sustentabilidad ambiental, la sustentabilidad financiera y económica de las empresas y las corporaciones y de todos pasa por la construcción de un proyecto ético. Y todos estos elementos son parte de un proyecto ético que necesitamos cambiar, porque los latinoamericanos que no nos hemos beneficiado de las industrias extractivas, de los beneficios de las industrias extractivas, tenemos una concepción genuina de que es una industria de daño. Y lo único que podemos hacer es pasar a que sea una industria de riesgo, en un marco de un proyecto ético que pueda operar en América Latina. No sé si tengo para pasar.
Oh.
Gracias. O sea, hoy lo que estamos teniendo es un escenario de desplazamiento de comunidades tradicionales, primarización de la economía, se están externalizando los impactos ambientales, destrucción y pérdida de biodiversidad, cooptación y corrupción, en fin. Este es el escenario en el que estamos moviéndonos, perdón, y por lo tanto hay conflicto. O sea, lo que estamos viendo es que no debe haber nada más triste que ver el mapa de conflictos, que cuando uno hace los traslapes mineros, petroleros, en fin, estamos en un escenario de gravedad. Pero además no es el mismo ciudadano latinoamericano que vive en las comunidades hace 50 años. Es un ciudadano informado, es un ciudadano que conoce sus derechos, es un ciudadano que accede a Internet, es un ciudadano que accede a las redes sociales y es un ciudadano que exige cada vez más. Por eso es de que todos estos intentos de distribución de responsabilidad social empresarial, de una serie de cosas, no están funcionando, porque este ciudadano está cada vez más empoderado y a la vez cada vez más indignado. Entonces, lo que nosotros tenemos es cómo pasamos de una actividad que está generando daño a una actividad que sea de riesgo. Porque el riesgo se puede prever cuando hay conocimiento. Hoy, nosotros no podemos saber si estamos en riesgo o no estando en este edificio, porque no conocemos, pero se puede destruir, se puede caer la estructura, y solo es un tema de conocimiento. ¿Y qué es lo que está pasando? Que ese conocimiento tiene que ser público, abierto y transparente para todas las comunidades. Hoy la lógica es, se guardan bajo 7 llaves los estudios de impacto ambiental, se bajan bajo 7 llaves contratos ultra secretos, entonces la comunidad tiene derecho a sospechar de lo que está pasando. Entonces, la única posibilidad que tenemos para prever riesgos es conocer. Pero para tener seguridad y para poder prevenir tiene que haber institucionalidad. Y eso es lo que no tenemos en América Latina. Instituciones serias, transparentes, que sean capaces de otorgarnos seguridad. Y finalmente, la única posibilidad de la defensa para proteger es con tecnología. Todo eso para construir un proyecto ético, es la única oportunidad que tenemos para construir un proyecto ético en la que una actividad de la cual la gente tiene orgullo y quiera pertenecer. Es la única posibilidad que tenemos para restaurar, para recuperar, es con conocimiento, con institucionalidad y con tecnología. ¿Para qué? Para que pueda ser para beneficio de la dignidad humana, porque los latinoamericanos nunca hemos entendido que la naturaleza es un bien público y siempre lo hemos corporativizado. Siempre hemos pensado que es de las corporaciones o de ciertos sectores. Y la única posibilidad que tenemos para frenar y apagar esta olla de presión que está hirviendo a baja intensidad es que sea un proyecto ético para la dignidad humana. Por eso es de que todo lo que sea conocimiento público para prevenir riesgo tiene que ser absolutamente abierto a las comunidades, a las instituciones, a los medios, y hoy es absolutamente ultra secreto. Entonces, ¿cómo manejamos esto como una opción? El conocimiento como una opción de diálogo y como una opción de mitigación y no como una opción de poder. La institucionalidad que sea inclusiva. No podemos seguir permitiendo que se considere a la audiencia pública, a la consulta pública como un mecanismo de extorsión y chantaje de parte de comunidades y movimientos de base a las empresas. No podemos seguir, tenemos que exigir que las empresas entiendan que ellos también construyen lo público. Y lo público lo construyen desde prácticas éticas, desde contrataciones responsables, de tal manera de que ellos también contribuyan a este problema. Prácticas de responsabilidad social empresarial. Y yo creo que esta tenía una evolución que es interesante, porque mientras a un principio se hablaba de licencia legal, después las comunidades han dicho, nosotros tenemos el derecho de darles la licencia para operar. Ya hay hoy en varios proyectos paralizados la demanda de licencia para lucrar. Entonces, ese es cómo ha ido evolucionando este tema y eso es cómo. ¿Por qué? Porque si es de que la gente en las comunidades dice, si es que nos van a dejar ríos envenenados, no va a haber posibilidades de cosas, por lo menos tengamos derecho a participación. Y eso es lo que está pasando en el terreno. Cadenas de valor y, por supuesto, renta y regalías. La histórica, y es desde Bulmer Thomas que nos decía de la dependencia de América Latina con las industrias extractivas, con las materias primas, y la historia de nuestras luchas fundamentalmente es la disputa por la renta de los recursos naturales. Porque todo esto, como nunca ha sido parte de una distribución de un proyecto ético, esta disputa ha sido absolutamente asimétrica. Entonces, la pregunta ¿es posible radicalizar la consulta y la democracia aprovechando el uso de las tecnologías de información y comunicación? ¿Es un promotor, la consulta, es un promotor del desarrollo o es un activador de venganzas sociales y de fragmentación social? Y la tecnología ética, como hoy nosotros vemos, de que prácticamente una de las industrias con menor inversión en innovación es el sector minero petrolero. Pero podemos pensar en estándares éticos de la operación, en gestión de huella hídrica, en gestión de huella de carbón, en innovación. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos hacer para que esto mitigue impacto y a la vez sea parte de un proceso que nos permita generar mayor valor? Entonces, por eso es de que nosotros compartimos la visión de futuro. Construir relaciones de confianza entre distintos sectores para hacer de las industrias extractivas un modelo ético de creación de riqueza. No estamos pidiendo la moratoria petrolera, no, somos conscientes de que vamos a tener industrias extractivas por los próximos 80, 100 años en nuestros países y va a ser absolutamente, nuestras economías van a continuar siendo absolutamente dependientes de esto. Pero la pregunta es, ¿puede ser sustentable el modelo en el que venimos practicando con todos los antecedentes que nos han dicho? No. Entonces, la única posibilidad que tenemos es crear un modelo ético de creación de riqueza basado en la dignidad humana, en la inclusión económica y en la conservación de los bienes ecosistémicos. Es la única posibilidad que tenemos para que esta industria pueda sobrevivir y no tengamos un proceso de fragmentación social que pueda ser alarmante en el futuro. Y hay ejemplos. El Grupo de Diálogo Latinoamericano, donde nosotros como ABINA hemos sido un factor para construir condiciones para diálogos de una desconfianza eterna entre grupos ambientalistas y mineras y petroleras, donde hemos sido capaces de gradualmente en un proceso de construcción de confianza ir avanzando en este tema, y los resultados son importantes, los resultados son esperanzadores. Así que creemos de que se puede avanzar en esta línea en la que se pueda construir vínculos de confianza, en la que tanto la empresa como la sociedad civil y el Estado puedan avanzar en la construcción de este proyecto ético. Sin embargo, es responsabilidad de cada uno de nosotros que su norte ético sea uno solo, que es la dignidad humana. El resto no nos interesa. Si no vamos a hacer para la dignidad humana, no habremos hecho lo suficiente. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días a todos. Hello everyone. I will speak in English, but I can take any questions in Spanish as well, like the rest of the panelists. First of all, it's hard to speak last because you're right before the lunch, but also you have to sort of like try to modify your speech to not repeat everything you just heard from this excellent group of panelists. So I'll try to make it as straightforward as I can. And first of all, I would like to thank the Wilson Center and the World Bank for inviting me to participate in this event. It is my pleasure to be here with you today. I am Juan Cruz Vieira, and I am not exactly an extractive specialist. I actually have been working on transparency and anti-corruption for the last 10 years at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I happen to work in the extractive industries for the last 4 years. So last week I actually was in Lima with Danny and many other people here at the audience for the 7th Global Conference of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And there are many issues that were discussed during this conference that I think would be interesting to sort of kick off the conversation. So first, I would like to say that this is a very timely event, and for many reasons. In my view, the main topic discussed in the EITI conference last week in Lima was how to do more with less. Countries, as you heard in previous presentations, rich in natural resources all over the world are facing the consequences of an epic fall in the price of commodities. This actually means fewer investments, reduced revenue from taxes, and increased fiscal and budgetary constraints. I think this is an important topic because there's a double question that I think we should ask ourselves. Number one, how to integrate good governance and transparency into the way governments and companies work, but also how good governance actually leads or can lead to better economic outcomes for citizens. And so basically I would like to share 4 things with you from our experience that I think it would be useful to kick off the conversation. The first one, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I think it's important to mention, is restoring trust. And I believe it's important to start by actually saying that perhaps the single most important challenge of governance in the extractive sector at all levels of government is to build trust among stakeholders and to maintain it. And here I'm referring to trust in the institutions that manage the resources coming from the extractive industries, but also trust in companies and agencies in charge of controlling and overseeing the activities in the sector. I think we can all agree, and it's been said by previous panelists, that transparency is a fundamental first step to achieve and sustain trust. Transparency means making available information that is credible, accessible to anybody, and constantly updated and timely published and user-friendly. I think Tony mentioned something that is critical, which is actually the credibility of information. And I'm going to get into detail on that later on. But in the past 10 years at the IDV, we've supported over 60 initiatives in all countries of the region aimed at reducing information asymmetries. So we actually know this is a complex and it's a gradual process, but nevertheless, it is a necessary condition for good governance, and we should understand it as that. But we can also agree that transparency is not enough, and we've been hearing that. And why? Because our region is facing a deep crisis of trust in governments and their ability to manage public resources with integrity. And the crisis of legitimacy has not only to do with governments in office, but also with other key institutions that are super important in our democracies. And I include here the judiciary, as Danny has just mentioned. Mm-hmm. So the example that Danny brought to the table about, if you saw it in that graph, 7th out of the, I think, 11 countries that are the better performers on transparency are from Latin America, but that doesn't mean that we're doing good. If you look at specifically the rule of law, for example, indicator of that picture that Danny showed, the green countries, the ones that are doing better, 50 points out of 100 is the average for Latin American countries. For the OECD countries, the rule of law indicator ranks 95% points in average out of 100. So citizens are demanding high quality services and less corruption. We know that. We also know that the threshold for inefficiency and corruption is lower and lower. Gabriel mentioned some important facts about mobilization and how that actually leads to conflict. And the recent events that we've seen in Guatemala or Brazil are just examples that demonstrate the power of citizens and the power of informed middle classes that use information technologies not only to push for better outcomes for themselves, but also to be more informed and participate in public affairs. As it was discussed in the previous panel, the era of abundance appears to be over. The fall of commodities generated a growing uncertainty in the global economy and a sense of unrest in the extractive sector. And to put it clearly for you, I think in Latin America we are at a complicated crossroads, and I think that's why this event is timely, because widespread lack of institutions overlaps nowadays with tensions over the price of commodities. This combination is creating different cracks in our societies, but also in our businesses. A recent study by Harvard, and actually co-authored by Tony, shows that extractive projects are worth between 3 and 5 million have reported weekly losses of 20 million and production delays caused by social conflicts. And these issues have been present all over Latin America. An analysis of 190 projects operated by international oil companies, and here we're talking about large-scale projects, shows that the time required to meet the deadline for implementing projects has doubled when compared to previous decades. The key to restore trust is, as some of the panelists said, not just to care about enhancing fiscal transparency, but to communicate in a more effective, efficient, and transparent way to citizens what are the key benefits and impacts, and here I mean positive and negative impacts of the extractive industries. On this, let me just mention that there's still a limited understanding of impacts. The sector requires better metrics to monitor the effects of extractive industries, both positive and negative. And this is important to leverage opportunities and mitigate potential risks. I don't think we have robust information yet on human and social capital generated by extractives, and this is just one topic that we need to work on. The second topic I would like to put on the table, I'm not going to go into detail, but I think we can discuss this during the round of questions, is enhance institutional capacity of the subnational level of governments. I think this is crucial, as Danny mentioned and Gabriel as well, because the key question is how to enhance transparency and efficiency at the local and municipal level, because we are here in Latin America, we're facing a delicate balance, in my opinion. On the one hand, we have been receiving, the local governments have been receiving more resources as a result of transfers for royalties with broader responsibilities due to decentralization schemes. But these governments do not have the institutional capacity needed to manage these resources and responsibilities efficiently and effectively, and in particular with regards to public investments. Local governments are, as you all know, the closest interface between companies and civil society. If local governments cannot deliver on providing services, that create pressures for companies to step in and fill this gap. And this can create a situation in which civil society has misplaced expectations about the role of private sector and companies. And this, I think, is a crucial issue. In a book that recently we just published at the IDB, we brought a few copies for you today. We have analyzed, for example, the case of Brazil. This case study shows that greater flow of resources from royalties can actually be associated with less transparency and fewer controls. I invite you to take a look at this excellent chapter Martin Ardenas, which is I think chapter 10, because it's a very interesting case study. Corruption thrives in weak institutions. We know that. In several countries, adjustments to decentralization frameworks are necessary, particularly to the way in which fiscal transfer systems and the general royalty systems are managed. Subnational governments also lack the capacity for long-term planning, and we have a deficit in the way the processes in the long term happens to take place with the central and the local governments. Conversations needs to happen, dialogue needs to happen, but we also need better planning of extractive industries in Latin America. So what can be done? I think maybe just to point out two things. First, to put technological innovations and the use of information and communication technology at the forefront of the extractive industries governance agenda in our countries, I think is crucial. Infrastructure development of open data, for example, in the energy and the mining sector, represents today a great input for policy reform. We've seen these in many countries, so I'll go into detail about one that is particularly interesting in my opinion. But digital platforms and georeferencing information are creating a huge input for policy reform and sort of better governance arrangements in the sector. The case of Colombia in particular I think is interesting. There's a creation of a platform, and full disclosure here, the IDB supported this, for georeferencing 30%, approximately 30% of the national the whole royalty systems, which actually happens to be 30% of the public investment system in Colombia. And this actually provides traceability throughout the whole entire cycle of public investments, from the resources that are being extracted to the use of those resources as part of public investments. This initiative and many others that we can discuss during the questions demonstrate that transparency in the subnational governments is possible because of governance reforms that actually happen at the central level of government. And the third point that I would like to use is maybe just to put on the table as because I don't have a lot of time, but use the public investment systems at the central level to instill reform into local governments. For example, if local governments are not executing and they don't have the institutional capacity, in the case of Colombia, they're somehow prevented from keep receiving resources, right? And this is a huge transformation and a huge process, a hugely important process that has happened in Colombia since the year 2012 and 13, which I believe that is necessary to bring to the attention of the audience. We have examples in Ecuador, but so the actual important the use of public investment systems, I think, is that it helps in three specific ways. First, it connects the budget cycle with the implementation of public investment programs. Second, it ensures the traceability of public investment resources for citizens to have timely and quality information on the entire investment cycle. And third, it improves management decision making on the side of public officials. So better manage public investment systems, in our opinion, and we have seen that from experience, strengthen both accountability and government capacity. So I'm going to leave it there so we can actually have some time for questions. But I think, again, we'd like to thank the Wilson Center and the World Bank for inviting us, and we're very happy to be here and share some thoughts with you.
Okay. Thank you very much for these great presentations from this panel. And At this point, we are ready to open up for questions and answers. And since I'm sitting here, I will take the advantage of asking the first question, if I may. And picking up a little bit on what Juan Cruz was just saying, revenues from natural resources time and again do not make it back to the producing regions. And a lot of times subnational governments argue that part of the problem is that they themselves lack the capacity to manage these resources and reinvest them in a way that will be efficient for the local population. As way of an anecdote, I was talking to the governor of the oil-producing region in Kenya once, and he was telling me that part of the problem was that the central government had given him such a convoluted system for presenting developing projects to be funded with the oil money that he thought he was an opposition politician, so he thought it was something against him that the central government was doing, that it was not his fault or anything. Again in Peru with the SNP process, where there were so many issues in trying to execute projects through the process. So a lot of times donors and governments try to find solutions to this by increasing, with policies that try to increase the capacity of the local government, of the subnational government. My question is, do you think that that is enough to solve this issue? Or do you think that there is also another dimension that has to do with politics, maybe with corruption, that we are not able to capturing, and which is preventing this money from extractives from making it back to the producing areas? And a second part of that question is, if you could provide some examples, positive examples, where transparency initiatives did contribute to improve subnational governance efficiencies in this respect. Whoever wants to start first. Tony, you want?
Anyway, I'll take the heat. So, I think, thank you. It's thank you for the easy question that you're just posing. I think there are just many parts of that, in order to build a response to that. But one of the critical, I think I would like to focus on two things. As you were speaking, I was just thinking about something that Tony said. So I'm passing the ball to you on political economy, and I think we can't escape that conversation in some ways. Reform happens where countries and governments in particular are completely willing to move forward on reforms. And so whenever civil society or even organizations like mine try to work with countries on a set of reforms, in our case, for example, we cannot do anything if the government is not fully on board. And I think this is a critical issue. It has to do with ownership and sort of, and it brings this idea of the political economy to the forefront of the discussion. We were at Brookings, I think, a year ago with Danny launching the book, and the first question he actually asked me isn't the political economy, and I think this issue still needs to be discussed and put on the table. The second part of the equation is the role of international organizations. And I think in many ways, international organizations actually can have a role in bringing dialogue to this tripod of civil society, governments, and companies. And in many cases, we have seen that working for many years in a project, or even at the local level, bringing the stakeholders together, creating platform for discussion and dialogue leads to good results. no matter how profitable destructive project at the end of the day ends up being, just opening the door for dialogue and bringing stakeholders together, it will get you a long ways. And I think I think in the presentation by Gabriel, I think the idea is that to sort of being able to open those doors and create dialogue, and that is inclusive, and that it does not only relate to the information related to the fiscal regime, or even to even on contracts and so forth, but really because this is a very complex sector in which you have very complex information, so that you have to put out there, like contracts and so forth, but you also have to be able to find a way to explain to citizens in the way the citizen would understand what are the concrete benefits and the impacts, positive and negative impacts of destructive industry. So that's my 2 cents on that particular question.
Okay. Tony, yes.
So, I think before thinking about capacities, one of the things to bear in mind is the extent to which, where there has been significant transfer of revenues to subnational levels, of just how much that has transformed those subnational levels. It's transformed people's imaginaries of development. It's transformed their expectations of the future. It's transformed political incentives. It's transformed certain regions in ways that are really appalling. You think about the subnational politics in Ancash in Peru now compared to pre-Antamina, which transforms into questions of everyday citizen safety and so forth. So I think obviously capacity building is an important part of a response, but prior to that is a read of the ways in which incentives and aspirations have been so transformed by the transfers to date is an essential first start. And I think the other thing I'd say is, everything has supply side and demand side elements, and if you're building capacities in a context of chronic political competition, corruption, violence, and so forth, your capacities are not going to do you a whole lot of good if there's not also the exercise of pressure from the demand side, which goes back to questions of building analytical capacities in society to monitor, building media capacities to report on this, and building, I was also in Lima at the Extractive Industries meetings last week, but I was moderating a side event for Publish What You Pay and Oxfam, and the theme of that side event was the reduction of civic space in many EITI compliant countries, mind, Latin America and elsewhere. So another part of that response would be not just enhance media and analytical capacities, but some mechanism to protect those people who are doing that media and analytical work, to hold local authorities to account.
Danny?
Just to complement that and to take your very good provocative question. But first, one thing I didn't do for the lack of time is also to thank Cynthia and Augusto for this event and for the invitation. Let me suggest a couple of things related to this area that you're asking. Is what's called in the field revenue sharing, right? And how to allocate the benefits at the subnational level. What are the rules of what stays in the center, what's allocated, and how best to allocate? It's an extremely complicated area. Political economy, as suggested, comes in. I would suggest that it's not necessarily the case that that everywhere the producing regions are getting less of what they should get. In fact, that's a very contentious issue that begins from the question, who are the real owners and who should benefit from the resources of the country? And of course, as part of this revenue sharing literature and the evolving state of the art, there are a number of principles, and one of the principles is achieving some balance and the consensus issue and a discussion between the national and local level, but it should be a national level discussion. Why should the poor regions in terms of resources be denied from that? I would suggest, for the sake of discussion and provocation, that in the case of Peru, they went overboard in terms of the formula, benefiting basically the producing regions 3 times over. As a result, in fact, not only was inequity, but enormous inefficiency, because some of these municipalities overnight got 500 times the resources that they had before, and they did not have the political, institutional, or governance capacity to manage them, while the resource poor regions were not getting anything. While in other settings, Chile is much more centralized, so it's distributed much more evenly, and there is a question whether there should be a bit more decentralization. So there is a serious technical and political economic issue there, and balance is the issue. The context, as you and others have said, matters a lot. So every country has to engage in this type of national dialogue, eventually arriving at a consensus with a lot of dialogue, transparency regarding a particular formula. Achieving national consensus on what should be the formula allocation should be known to all, it should be codified in law, and this revenue sharing should be transparent, it should verify an amount. So there's a set of about 10, 15 kind of principles. I would just suggest first, I think this is an important book you edited, and I would recommend everybody read it. The Brazil chapter is really interesting, as you suggested. The others, we just launched a report exactly on this for Myanmar. Every country is different, so it's a context, and we're doing work on others. The fiscal responsibility issue, the dialogue and managing expectations is key. Now, you asked about examples. I think it's really important to also note that some countries are making inroads at the subnational level, and they're good examples. One innovation is in Peru, subnational government forecasting resource revenue, and that's really interesting what's happening there in Piura and Arequipa, where methodology has been created to predict medium-term revenue forecast, and they were crucial to reduce uncertainty. There is also in Indonesia, there are very interesting innovations in the province of Bojonegoro regarding the same type of issues, as well as sovereign wealth fund, which is now before parliament, the local parliament, but as well it has to be approved by the central government, by the Ministry of Home Affairs. Colombia is doing also very interesting innovations in this context. In Indonesia, the company Pertamina, that's a state-owned company, and Exxon Mobil have agreed that that basically 10% is devoted to local government in the district of Bojonegoro. And that those are subject to Bojonegoro regulations for local content. So there's a set of examples that show that yes, this can be done. Much of what we discussed earlier at the national level applies even more so at the subnational level, where usually the political and institutional system is not as developed, and it needs much more work than that. Unfortunately, what's happening in many settings at the subnational level, because of the void of local government that is not there, the expectations from the population is that the company is going to supplant that and resolve that. And there the companies need to work more with local government and central government to ensure that the state, both at the local and at the central level, takes on its part. It could be, in fact, an engine for institutional development, but this whole notion that the company is expected to supplant the local government has to do away. And I'm not talking just about Latin America at the subnational level. We see that in many other regions as well.
Okay, thank you. And so let's open the floor now, and let's take 3 questions at a time. Maybe we'll start with you, sir, here, and then with this gentleman here, and then, you.
Hi, Eric Hyman, USAID Economic Policy Office. there are a lot of parallels between your experience in extractives and the land requirements for large-scale renewable energy development, and also forestry resources, which are also quite critical in Latin America for and abundant and sources of revenue in some countries. So could you discuss whether your organizations are working in parallel on renewable energy and forestry issues, or are there other efforts that are trying to join these various groups working in these two different areas together to cooperate on some very similar types of issues?
Is the question for anyone in particular?
Anyone, yes.
I'll take it again. So you mentioned, for example, forestry, and yes, it is. In our view, and I worked for a division that looks at transparency and governance issues, and one of the things that we've been looking at is exactly that. What are the parallels and the dynamics that we need to be aware of in, for example, the forestry sector that could actually be interesting to bring into the conversation of natural resource governance. And so I'm not a specialist on that, and I can't give you the technical initiatives or the details of the initiatives. So, we can exchange cards, and I can put you in contact with people that work specifically on these issues. But absolutely necessary to think about the dynamics of enhancing governance in extractives and sort of the important parallels that you can see in the forestry and even in the water sector.
A bit of provocation. Yes, there are some parallels, and in terms of some of the environmental, social issues and so on. But there are also huge differences. The fact that one is renewable, and in oil, gas, and mining, we're dealing with resources that are depletable, makes a huge difference. And in terms of the economics and the optimal rate of extraction, in terms of optimal rates of savings at the macroeconomic level, it makes a big difference if you're basically banking on a resource that is finite versus one that is renewable. But let's face it, there's another major reason to also focus on these issues with different implications than water or forestry. And that's a new reality in terms of commodity prices, and if you couple that with the climate change, which I agree that has not been discussed enough. One way of putting it is that the days, particularly for the carbon-intensive extractives, so we're talking oil and coal in particular, but some mining, are numbered, okay? So, and look at the prices and what has happened. I think, and I'm Chilean, I think we need to pause and go back to history. What happened one day in Chile when a German scientist invented a synthetic form of salitre? How do we say that in English? Yes, which was basically the main extractive from Chile. At some point, we need to start thinking about the post-oil and post-copper and post-mining era, also to copper. At someday there will be probably a synthetic form. And we have not discussed enough the whole issue of importance of diversification and the implication that we are still in this mode that these countries are so resource rich. And yes, they are resource dependent, diversify a little bit, but this is very marginal and it has not really happened. Even my own country, Chile, it's just so dependent on copper. We need to start thinking about the post-copper era. That's not the same, obviously, on issues of water, land. And it's a very different dynamic. So I think we have a very different type of challenge in our hands, which deserve focus. Not to say, and that's also the type of expertise, the type of issues of revenue sharing we're discussing and so on requires different treatment, and that's why different organizations have different comparative advantages and expertise on that, I would say. But in terms of this, the reality of today, I would make even that sharper distinction. We need to think about the post-extractive era and what does it mean for the resource-rich countries in the area, and we're not doing that enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just wondering whether there are possibilities for coalition building that might advance the transparency and social and environmental safeguards in both sectors by working together in these two.
Yeah, let me just add absolutely on that. And in fact, we were extremely pleased. We've been very involved in the whole transparency movement for extractive, and the Dodd-Frank for mandatory disclosure of payments, basically thanks to the Dodd and Senator Dodd and Congressman Frank and other, they passed that legislation. It's been back and forth in the regulatory challenges and legal challenges from the American petroleum industry, but we hope that will be resolved very soon. This is 5 years in the making. In the meantime, Europe leapfrogged over the US leadership on those issues, and it's already adopted, it's under implementation. And in the EU directive, they included forestry. So that was a very welcome addition. Even in terms of EITI, some countries in EITI, which are progressive enough, and country contacts and adaptation is very important. We are all encouraging to also include the other sectors. So when it comes to issues like transparency, absolutely. But yeah, so on that, yes.
You're okay. Okay, next person, yeah.
Yeah, it's a question for Anthony. During an era of high prices and a particular type of high investment or a time of high investment in Latin America comes associated with specific types of conflict. And you mentioned conflict as a driver for institutional change. Now that investment is shrinking and that problems are going to be different, what do you think are the types of conflict that we might see moving forward? What are the types of policies that are going to come associated with that?
I mean, I think in the first session, some of the possible conflicts looking forward were put on the table. New social tensions around changes in patterns in distribution of rents and of surplus. My sense, it's kind of slightly sidestepping the question, but it's related to what Danny was just saying. I think that in some regard, this period of lower prices is an opportunity. It's an opportunity also to have discussions about national subnational relations that would have been that much harder to have in contexts where resources are already being decentralized. This applies to countries where there's fiscal decentralization or fiscal transfers. When less is being transferred, the incentives to be able to have a discussion around rethinking central subnational relationships, I think, are greater now. So it's a context in which conversations are possible now, which would have been much harder to have in the context of high prices and large transfers. Some of the conflicts that I think are going to be important, but coming back to the climate change discussion again, is that whatever happens going forward on extractives in the region is going to interact more and more with discussions around water. And I can imagine growing conflict. There's already been conflicts around water, of course, but growing conflicts around the question of water governance, water management, looking down the line, not so much because of the reduction of prices, so much as the intersection between whatever happens to the extractive sector and climate change issues. So that, I think, is going to be a field of very important discussion, and there's going to have to be a lot of strategic discussion around water resource management, nationally and subnationally. What else? So I'll leave it to that rather than take a lot of time. But I think water is going to be a really critical one. Sorry? Especially for mining, yeah, especially for mining, yeah. There's going to be a series of I mean, I think it's related to the question from the person at your side as well, around renewables as well, with transition. And renewables, to the extent that they're very land intensive, are also going to raise issues of displacement, of territory, of control. And I imagine some of the dynamics that have played out in conflicts around extractives may well play out in conflicts around renewables.
And also, just to complement, and also perhaps the issue of ownership of subsoil resources versus land ownership, which continues to be an issue and will be there for a while. We have a question here from this gentleman. He needs, a mic. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. My name is Walter Tejada with Tejada Consulting Services, and great to be here at the Wilson Center, and thank you for having this very important discussion, and I want to thank the panelists for all the information presented so far. And I was particularly glad to see the focus of mention of the subnational government, because I think too many times that when we discuss any type of policies around different countries is thought of focus on the national government or central government, whereas the implementation usually is taking place at the local level. So my question is, in a combination of an ideal factor that a well-run local government, at the same time there is some good economic development taking place, and the rule of law is being respected in an ideal world, at least from the illusion of a democracy that some of us like to think of to promote, in taking into account that Latin America is a different region than the Middle East, whether it's social and cultural values and all that kind of stuff. What are some of the specifics that you can suggest or point to that could be duplicated? I mean, I know we're all looking for that ideal example where it can be duplicated with no problems and there's not such a thing. But what I think what happens a lot of times is people use all kinds of obstacles of why it cannot be done. We need to be a little more aggressive of how it can be done. Again, take into account cultural traditions and differences in regions and all of that. But for example, there's a multitude of free trade agreements that have been made, and you kind of wonder if it's more for the U.S. companies getting richer at the expense of drying out labor and or not really stimulating the economies, at least in Central America, like the CAFTA and other Central American Free Trade Agreement and other agreements. So what are some examples that we can be touting more specifically? I know that Daniel mentioned a few examples of some countries, but I think we need to go even deeper than that, because if the local government, whether it's, we think of in the U.S. as state, county, city, or town, what are we talking about in general that could be more of success stories that we can advocate more and help some of us who want to help democracies in different places that we might have roots from?
Would like to answer that? Yes. Yes.
Cindy Arnson from the Wilson Center. Just to follow on Walter's question, I'm interested specifically in the cases of Camisea in Peru, which was one of the first examples that came out in terms of the amount of revenue being shared with the local government from gas development. If you could give us some specifics, Tony, on what has happened there, given that case has been out there for so long as an example of how local governments were being enriched and didn't have, capacity. But I also have a question for Gabriel in terms of the way Bolivia has managed these questions, particularly around the development of lithium. And if you could give us some sense of the multiple factors that are being taken into account as Bolivia either goes forward or doesn't go forward with the development of lithium deposits.
So, Gabriel, would you like to?
No, primero los dos y después entro yo. No, please.
I think I've not worked directly in Camisea. I've done interviews with local authorities in the area around Camisea and with elected officials in Cusco and with the company. And one of the this is just a few years ago, one of the concerns in those interviews continues to be the non-effective, non-efficient investment of the Camisea canon. Hyper expenditure in some authorities that happen to receive a lot in, bueno, sabemos, no, the palacios municipales and the waterfalls in the plaza, and the implication being that, I mean, I think it goes back a little bit to the high prices question. The implication being that when incentives get changed so much, it's very difficult to learn in a way that translates into changed action. And that potentially the lower period of lower prices gives a possibility for learning about, well, why did that continue to be the case after so long in Camisea? Why was it that resources continued to be not well invested? So I think, you know, this is a moment for some retrospective studies in certain areas like that to draw lessons from the period of boom, with the relative kind of room for maneuver to have debates that were more difficult under the period of boom, to have those debates now ahead of whatever the next boom is, whether it's around extractives again or whether it's around renewables. So I guess that's all I would say about Camisea. The only thing I would say is we haven't actually, and I didn't either, talked about parliamentarians at all. And your question about Camisea made me think of those interviews I had with people on the regional government. There has to be a role, presumably, in these processes of enhancing transparency, enhancing ability to work with information and to turn that information into proposals. Important work to be done with parliamentarians at a national level and at a subnational level. So it's not just a question of NGOs and the media and think tanks and NRGI and universities and multilaterals. Parliamentarians often get left out of this discussion, and yet in the end it's such an important space for questions of transparency and accountability.
Thank you. A ver, la historia de Bolivia está ligada a los ciclos económicos de las materias primas. Bolivia, cuando nace la independencia, nace con el ciclo de la plata en Potosí, que dura hasta el 1900, y después se abre, Potosí pierde vigencia y se abre el ciclo del estaño, que se va a Oruro, Poder Político La Paz. Antes Poder Político Sucre, ahora se abre, el nuevo escenario se abrió del 1875 en adelante, que fue el ciclo del estaño, que duró hasta el 85, en la que su epicentro Oruro y alrededores, y La Paz con poder político. En los 60 se abre el ciclo del petróleo y del gas, pero por supuesto mucho antes, desde el 30 que empiezan los pozos petroleros en Bolivia, pero se abre este nuevo ciclo del estaño, del gas y el petróleo, en la que el epicentro es Tarija, Santa Cruz, sobre todo Santa Cruz, en la que empieza. Y resulta que con el litio, porque Bolivia tiene la mitad de las reservas del mundo de litio, vuelve este ciclo a Potosí. Y ojalá que sea con la esperanza de, porque si hay algo que ha dejado, donde ha pasado estos ciclos, pobreza extrema. Ojalá que la esperanza ahora de la presencia del ciclo del litio en Potosí pueda ser una recuperación de la zona sudeste del país dentro de lo que es la provincia de Lipes, donde está Potosí. Hoy es un centro, yo diría, de disputas entre empresas, ofertas de tecnologías y coqueteos con el gobierno para ver quién obtiene la concesión. Por otro lado, un interés del gobierno de desarrollar una industria de recursos evaporíticos, pero no hay absolutamente nada concreto de qué es lo que va a hacerse el gobierno de Bolivia, pero en todo caso, Bolivia empieza a apostar su nuevo futuro económico una vez más en los recursos naturales y en esta apertura de este nuevo ciclo como es la del litio.
Muy Muy bien. As we can do another, I think, a last set of questions.
Maybe I'll take a little bit.
Oh,
of,
sorry.
No.
Yes.
But just on the question on the subnational level, I think there are maybe 2 or 3 things that I would like to mention. First, I think Danny mentioned EITI in LAC, and he mentions that as an opportunity to do more. Right? We have few countries. But still, we have seen a huge increase in the attention of EITI. And you have Peru and Trinidad and Tobago and Guatemala, they're compliant. And we have Colombia, Mexico, Honduras, and Dominican Republic that are actually formally candidates of the EITI process. One of the innovations, so-called innovations of the EITI in Latin America, in particular in Peru, is to take EITI at the subnational level. So I think the case of Moquegua, and we can share information on this bilaterally, but I think it's very important to take into account. But maybe two other things related to subnational level. Number one, or actually sort of framework to reinforce or revamp the attention of transparency at the subnational level. There's 2 trends that I think that are important to take into account. Number one, the huge increase that we've had in Latin America of access to information laws, and how this has created space for innovation at the subnational level in particular. And I can mention the examples of Mexico and the city of Xalapa that have 330,000 inhabitants, in Argentina and Bahia Blanca 300,000 inhabitants, or larger cities like Quito, 2 million, in the state of Minas Gerais with Data Viva. But we have cases in which this has taken taken roots at the very local level. For example, in Ecuador, the municipality of Coca, only 45,000 inhabitants with 6 indigenous nations, created a platform for using and putting available for the citizens quality information on the use of resources coming from the extractive industries. I thought it was a fantastic example. This initiative is called Extrayendo Transparencia, and it's done by an organization called Grupo Faro. Again, we can exchange information on this, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's a very interesting example. The other thing that I think I'll just, towards your question, I think I'd like to put on the table is how can we use the whole movement around open government? And I think this is an opportunity again. And I think there's going to be spillovers to the extractive sector. I expect to see those spillovers in the extractive sector in many countries of the region. We have a few cases in which the Open Government Initiative has been successfully connected to the enhancing transparency in the extractive sector. I think Mexico is the case, is the most interesting case, in which many years ago they actually put a commitment in the Open Government Plan to be part of the EITI, and just recently they formalized that request. So I think that's another thing that we have to look into, and how countries are willing to include in their open government platforms. Finally, and I don't want to take too much time, but the idea of using big data, I think, again, is a huge opportunity to enhance transparency and governance at the local level. There is a lot of information available, and there are databases that are available. And with very scarce resources, we can actually do a lot by combining those databases to identify opportunities for corruption, risks, and of abnormalities of public expenditures. And we've seen this all over the region. I'll be happy to talk to you about cases in which a little bit of money has taken a long ways in trying to identify abnormalities in the use of public resources with big data solutions. So just to complement that.
Danny, would you like to?
Yeah, quickly. Yeah, backstopping what was just said, but not mincing any words. One of the reasons that in a number of countries, resource-rich countries in Latin America, there's been reticence to join initiatives like EITI is because of the subnational issue. There is concern about disclosing too much, which is then expected under EITI, and then the regions at the subnational level knowing much more who is getting what, which should be part of a transparent debate, but is concerned. I know, let me be very frank, in my own country, Chile has been quote-unquote wonderful over decades in improving rule of law and many of the other governance dimensions. There's always been a bit of a Prussian type of reticence about transparency. Mexico and other countries have come aboard transparency much earlier than Chile. So it's slow. I was just in Chile and discussing with a number of higher people joining EITI, and some wanted. Their vested interest also in the companies. They don't want full disclosure. So I echo the need to renew in Latin America this drive, because as pointed out by you and in one of my slides, a very colorful one of all the columns of all the dimensions that the EITI new standard now covers, subnational is absolutely key one. Second, I mentioned earlier some of the innovations that are taking place, Indonesia, Peru, Colombia. I was surprised you didn't do PR about your own IDB, Mapa of Regalias. I mean, it's a great innovation going on. You can all go online and see what IDB and Colombia is doing. We're also helping there in terms of mapping the whole issue of revenue sharing. We're going to launch a major volume on the subnational natural resource governance in the coming months, with all kinds of examples like that from around the world, not only about Latin America. This issue is just absolutely crucial and important. But yeah, if we can do together more of a push on EITI for Latin America. Mexico is very close. There's still some getting together between civil society and the government, and meeting of minds and convergence that is needed, but it's moving in the right direction. Brazil, I mean, it's nowhere yet, and it's such an opportunity right now, given the challenges and the lessons from Petrobras, for countries like Brazil to join the initiative. Major other countries, I mean, I just came back, as you said, from the board. They are Germany has joined, the US is in, the UK, Norway, many of the others. So countries like Brazil should be nudged to also embrace these frameworks of transparency.
Okay. Well, I think we don't have more time, right? For one more? Okay. One more question, yes.
Augusto de la Torre. It seems to me that we talk about transparency and accountability if they always move together. But do they? I wonder, and I have these questions particularly for Tony and Daniel. It seems to me that to harness transparency and convert it into accountability, you need other capacities. Mm-hmm. The role of the judicial system, the quality of monitoring capacities, maybe even the political process. So maybe we're simplifying too much by talking about transparency and accountability as if they always go together. But I wonder whether in your experience you have found that there are cases where they do and cases where you may advance a lot on transparency but still have a lousy management and accountability process. I wonder.
We take it in turns. You go first. El experto después el alumno.
You can. Well, okay, I'll take that one first. Well, absolutely. I mean, I've been accused in more popular types of talk of coining the notion of zombie transparency, and it comes from. In fact, I'll be very frank. It comes from one of the EITI examples. The first country in EITI to become compliant, and they trumpeted to the whole world about the success on how fantastic they are on disclosures and transparency, was which country? Azerbaijan. Okay, and Azerbaijan, they were producing these nice glossy reports and sending it to the board and so on. Now, if any journalists dared to try to analyze and put something on the press, they were put in jail. We have an advisory council member in NRGI, my organization, who has been 3 years in jail. He's a member of our advisory council because they speak up. So this is just an extreme example. Now, EITI has moved forward, and Azerbaijan has been demoted now because the civic space has declined so much. These closing civic space and the lack of civil society voice, it's a worldwide phenomena. Fortunately, there are exceptions, and Latin America is not doing as poorly as other regions, although there are clouds in the horizon, and you would know which countries they are. But civic space is closing around the world, and that's a major issue of discussion and debate. And those that were in EITI in Lima saw also that there was almost a rebellion about the issue of civil society, and it's in the economies and so on. You can read the details. But basically, transparency in the narrow disclosure sense, if not complemented by civic space and by an enabling environment for civil society, won't work. Fortunately, one of the things that we managed to do as a board in EITI is adopt a major protocol for what are the prerequisites of our civil society environment to be sufficiently robust to enable transparency to be translated into accountability. So that's one absolute key area. The other area, which EITI does not address in itself, and that's where complementary measures needed. You alluded to, we alluded to earlier too, and that's rule of law. Transparency with impunity does not deliver the goods. And it's very interesting to look in terms of governance case studies, pairing countries. So Chile and Mexico are very interesting case studies because Chile has always done better in rule of law. Mexico has always been done better in transparency. But I'm not going to comment on the rule of law. But obviously eventually you need the combination of both. Like you, I love econometrics too, and we have run regressions. There's nothing more potent than the interactive effects between media freedoms, this disclosure, transparency, and rule of law. Just having media freedom or transparency alone without the rule of law delivers about 1/3 of the impact of those interactive effects. So there you.
Which is why I wanted Danny to go first, because he's so much the expert on the question. And you presented on this last week at EITI a little bit as well. So it's so I just would add a couple of footnotes. One, indeed, on the panel I chaired last week or moderated on reducing civic space, 2 of the participants were from Azerbaijan, and one who'd been a leader on the EITI side from civil society is now living in exile here in the States. So the example is a good one. But I think they don't move together, and that was one of the reasons I was trying to say so much about the importance of working on the demand side and continuing to demand innovations. And so they're that combination of building analytical capacities in society, and building capacities in the media, and building capacity. I'm uncomfortable sometimes with capacity building as a language, but building capacities also in that part of the state that doesn't, if this exists, that doesn't depend so directly on the executive. Saying that's why bodies like the Human Rights Ombudsman in Peru have been so important in some of these regards, because they don't depend so directly on the executive, and so they can push back when that kind of disconnect between transparency and accountability becomes that much more apparent. So I think the implication is working on all those demand side areas is really, really important, and not necessarily terribly expensive. It's a long-term process, but it doesn't strike me that it's a costly process. I mean, we've talked about some of the organizations that have been mentioned, Grupo Faro, Propuesta Ciudadana. I mean, they do such important work, but they're not high-cost organizations. I also wanted to take advantage, just your question, the question that had been asked about conflicts caught me a bit flat-footed, but I want to mention two more because it's related to the distributional questions. Informal and illegal mining strikes me will be increasingly an issue. It's already an issue, but increasingly an issue because of displacements, because of the reduced employment opportunities elsewhere in economies. And this is kind of like a segue into the panel after the lunch. I don't know if the panelists will talk about this. But the whole issue of mining and the FARC and the peace process and the transition in Colombia strikes me as a potentially very tense and conflictive domain as well that's waiting for us. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much. And let's give a round of applause to this great panel. And I think a networking lunch is waiting for all of us. Thank you very much.
We had this session. We brought parliamentarians.